is what they're forced to endure.
They're not just Republican ghettos, they're loyalist ghettos as well. There's cases where loyalists have been shot dead by the security forces in suspicious circumstances. There's been cases where loyalists have been attacked and brutally beaten by the RUC. There's been cases where loyalists homes have been ransacked by the RUC. There's ultimate cases, you know, huge cases of gross civil abuses by the state against loyalists.
What gets me is the damage that they do, right? We get the housing executive here, they do your repairs for you, and say a week later, another raid. They'll say, what's that hole? Where'd you get that from? But you done that? Oh, is that right? And then they dig the same things all up again, knowing that they have already done that before. It's just madness, like.
I've worked in the field of human rights now for 20 years. I think what frightens me most is how particularly people whose rights are violated become increasingly used to it. For example, if I'm documenting human rights abuses, as I do all the time, you generally find with people under the age of 25 that unless they have been seriously physically injured, they do not consider their human rights to have been violated. Therefore, you'll get particularly young men who are persistently humiliated in the street, made to strip to the waist, take the socks and shoes off, quite often have their clothing thrown in the mud, will have everything taken out of a car if they have a car and left in the rain for them to put back in themselves. But if the police officer or soldier does not actually hit them, they consider themselves to have been very lucky and the incident not to be worth mentioning.
I don't know, you just get used to it. I could say used to it, but when they come, it frightens you. There's so many of them come in one wee space in your living room, and there's these guns. They put them down, they search each other, they do the raid. You get a sheet to say how much no damage they done, and then you search them and skin out. You know, as if they're going to steal something, and you search them, and that's the way it goes.
We've always taken abuse from the RUC anyway, only you don't expect that thing. When there's a death in the family, you don't expect that from anybody. You expect everybody to have a bit of respect when there's somebody has just been killed.
Well, after the court case, we won it, if you could say that, we won it. About a year later, they came and picked my son up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Rapped the door, came in with this warrant. Michael Beck, yes, he lives here. Can we have a word with him? What do you want it for? Under section 14. Well, what's that for? Attempted murder. Well, I started shaking. I didn't, you know, I said, attempted murder. And they run upstairs and they took Michael. Michael was getting on him and took him away. 6 o'clock in the morning. I was near in tears. I was shaking. I felt like I just wanted to be sick the whole day long. When I thought at first when he was lifted, I could only a couple of hours, couple of questions, he'd be thrown out again. But as the night wore on, I started getting awful sick and worried about him. And then it went on 2 or 3 days, and the next thing we heard, he was getting charged with attempted murder.
And what happens in those detention centres, that's one of the big issues right now, is that people will be forced to make confessions, that threats will be made against them, will be made against their family members. They might be beaten. People have had ear injuries. They've been kicked in the testicles. They've had lighters held to their testicles. They've been beaten around. Chairs are pulled out from under them. Chairs are thrown across the room. It's altogether a really intimidating experience. And they don't have the right to silence in those situations either. They can't just stay silent and wait for the lawyer to arrive, because if you stay silent, that can be inferred as an admission of guilt, that anything can be inferred from it. It's a very intimidating situation. People do get physically injured, and what happens ultimately is they sign confessions to things that they haven't done, or to things more serious than what they might have actually done. And those confessions can be used to get convictions. Without any other supporting evidence, without any corroborating forensic evidence, medical evidence, witness testimony, those confessions can then be used to put people in jail.
They physically and mentally beat him. And when I was talking to him myself, he says, Mum, I got that much. He says, I couldn't take no more. He says, I had to sign just to get out of there. He says, I couldn't. He says, they were driving me crazy. He says at one point that they had him that confused that he was saying into himself, God, did I do that? I must have done it. They said I done it, so I must have done it. So he was getting no sleep.
You've got people who have spent many, many years in remand before they would ever be convicted, and other people who have been convicted based solely on those confessions. And when you've got a system that lends itself to ill treatment, and then a trial system that lends itself to those confessions being the one and only piece of evidence that's ever going to make the difference in somebody's freedom or imprisonment, you've got a serious human rights problem.
It has been traditionally very hard to make human rights points in Northern Ireland without being branded either from one extreme or the other. What the CAJ has tried to do has been to measure the legislation operating in Northern Ireland and the practices of government in this area, to measure them against international human rights standards. Now, these are various conventions put together by the European Community or by the United Nations. The UK government has agreed to abide by these conventions, but when you look at the facts as they operate in Northern Ireland, one can see very many areas where the UK does seem to be in breach of both the spirit and the letter of many of these international conventions. If you look at the provisions to arrest people, what you find is a situation almost akin to martial law, whereby any soldier can arrest anybody for anything. There doesn't have to be a justification, there doesn't have to be any reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed. When you go on then to look at detention, once the police or the army have arrested somebody, generally they are taken to holding centres. There are 3 of them in Northern Ireland, Castlereagh being the best known one. They can hold somebody for 7 days, a full 7 days in Castlereagh. Now this power has been found to be in breach of the European Convention. Ordinary law allows them to hold somebody for up to 3 days, but you can be held for 7 days. And that is in a situation whereby you have no access to the outside world apart from occasional visits from your solicitor.
One of the issues in Northern Ireland, and it's an issue that's become a hotly debated one in recent years, is the right to silence, or the lack of the right to silence. Whereas in other judicial systems, people have the right to silence. If you don't want to say anything, you want to wait till your lawyer shows up, you can just remain silent. And that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you're guilty, it doesn't mean you're innocent, it just means you haven't said anything. In Northern Ireland, when you remain silent, which a lot of people will do if they're trying to wait for their lawyer to show up, and it takes 2 or 3 days for that to happen, the police and the judges can actually draw an inference from that. They can say, we've accused this person of something, they haven't denied it, so they must be guilty of it.
Now the key to it is if the police have a confession out of somebody, even though they can test that confession afterwards, and then they bring them to court, you have, it seems, around a 90% chance of getting a conviction. So the holding centre situation is extremely important in the authorities' fight against terrorism. Added to that, it's very difficult to get access to solicitors. The authorities can postpone access to solicitors for 48 hours, a full 2 days. Now that means that you can make many kinds of statements before you have any access to your solicitor. One of the most important rights as far as human rights activists are concerned is that you should have legal advice, somebody advising you on your rights, what you should say, what you shouldn't say, the implications of anything that you do say, the questions that the police are asking you. You don't have that in Northern Ireland. You may have a half-hour interview with your solicitor and then you're back to the police. Now, in England and Wales, if you are arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, you can have a solicitor with you while the police are questioning you. In Northern Ireland, that is not an option. It's impossible for solicitors to be present during the interviews. That's something we would like to see changed.
If you're convicted of an offence in the north of England and your family lives in the south of England, after a period of time you would be transferred to a jail near your family in the south of England. The only group of prisoners that's systematically excluded from those transfers are those prisoners who've been convicted for Irish Republican activity in England. And those prisoners are simply not getting the the transfer from the jail in England to the jail in the north of Ireland. We're convinced, and it isn't only our view, it's been publicly stated by the British government, by William Whitelaw, who was the Home Secretary in the early 1980s, that Irish Republican prisoners will be detained in those jails in England, not as a matter of penal policy, not because it's fair, not because it's legal, not because it's right. They will be detained in those jails in England as hostages.
The first time that I went over to England